welcome to the firm. On the show this week,
days before it goes live, SEBI dilutes the governance norms under Clause 49. Does the minority shareholder interest stand threatened? And the Supreme Court sets a new precedent for check bounce cases. Has the Apex Court made recovering of money onerous for creditors?
the new Clause 49 governance provisions were prompted by the Companies Act 2013. But Clause 49 goes further to impose more stringent conditions for director rotation, related party transactions and the like. Now, days before it comes into effect, the new Clause 49 has been clarified. Here are the highlights.
Generally speaking, the amendments to Clause 49 bring it in line with Companies Act 2013 provisions, except in one case. The proviso to Section 188 in the Act implies that no related party can vote on any related party transaction, even if that particular related party is unconnected to that specific transaction. MCA clarified this in July by saying only the concerned related party must abstain from voting. But SEBI's amended Clause 49 has done the opposite, saying all related parties must abstain from voting on all RPTs even if the related party is unconnected to that transaction.
The SEBI circular is a step in the right direction in terms of plugging the gap. But I also believe they've gone too far, because the ideal position should be the SEBI definition coupled with the MCA transaction clarification, because as long as you have a wide enough definition of related party, I think the spirit here is to ensure that the entire group of people who are related in the context of a particular transaction should not be permitted to vote on that transaction. Not to say that even if the party benefiting from the contract has no correlation to another party who vis-a-vis the company still qualifies as a related party, right? Then that party is also, per the current situation under the SEBI rules, effectively prevented from voting. So, to take a very loose example, if you have Tata and Birla who effectively, hold shares in an entity and each are separately related parties vis-a-vis that particular entity, certainly Tata and Tata Group entity should not vote on a contract between that company and a Tata Group entity. But what's the logic in, keeping out a Birla? I think a purposive interpretation in any event should permit a Birla to vote.
In the second important change, SEBI has diluted its definition of related party. Its April circular went beyond the company law definition to include entities related to a company if they are members of the same group, if one entity is an associate or joint venture of the other, and if both entities are joint ventures of the same third party. The amended definition now covers relations as per the Companies Act and accounting standards.
Ideally, in my opinion, both the Companies Act 2013 as well as Clause 49 should have stayed out of trying to defining related party transactions and the coverage when there is an entire accounting standard on that subject. The MCA is responsible for setting accounting standards that are applicable to companies anyway, so they have the ability to influence those standards. And I think because of this multiplicity of definitions in different places, and which leads to this harmonization of laws, we are such a difficult place to do business. So I think overall it's a great step to try and harmonize laws between at least Clause 49 and the Companies Act.
The third important change regarding RPTs is to do with materiality thresholds. In its April circular, SEBI defined material to include transactions exceeding 5% of annual turnover or 20% of net worth, whichever is higher. Only transactions exceeding these thresholds required approval via a special resolution in which related parties cannot vote. But SEBI has now removed the net worth threshold and increased the turnover threshold to 10%.
It should lead to a lesser number of transactions going to shareholders for approval. But the question behind it is that such a bad thing? And my view on that is no, because too much information is also not good, and in too much information you can lose what's really material, what's really important to look at. and therefore when you enhance the threshold from 5% to 10%, clearly one would think that lesser number of transactions would go for shareholder approval. And I agree with that view. Now, what is the right threshold? Is it 10%? Is it 15%? Is it 5%? Time will tell. But generally, it seems to be the right direction. Shareholder approval is a cumbersome, time-consuming process, and it should only be sought in those really extreme circumstances, which are really large, really out of the ordinary. And therefore, one would agree with making this simpler.
On the face of it, 5 looks a lot lower than 10. Therefore, it looks like it's more flexibility to companies in terms of limiting the number of transactions that need to go to the shareholders, or the threshold at which you need to go to the shareholders. But when you look at it in the context of the April circular, which had 5% or 20% of net worth, 5% of turnover or 20% of net worth, whichever was higher, 20% of net worth, to my mind, in most companies, not necessarily all, is likely to be a significantly larger sum than 10% of turnover. So this is in that sense actually a reduction in the threshold rather than an increase.
The fourth important amendment relates to independent directors. In a departure from the Companies Act 2013, SEBI's April circular said an independent director who has already served on a company's board for 5 years can serve only one more term of 5 years. SEBI has now eased this requirement and brought it in line with the Companies Act that gives independent directors 2 terms of 5 years each starting April 2014. The definition of independent has also been amended. SEBI's April circular gave a wide meaning to it to say that a person who has or had a pecuniary relationship with the company, its subsidiary, associate, promoters, directors, etc. will not be considered as independent. SEBI has now amended this to say that there should not be any material pecuniary relationship. But what is material has not been defined.
If one were to look at it purely conceptually, is there a benefit on account of there being a materiality threshold under the listing agreement, but when it's not there under the company statute? There is, because the company statute has a requirement for 1/3 of a board, in certain cases listed companies, certain other categories of companies, to be independent. Whereas the listing agreement says that if you have an executive chairman, that 1/3 jumps to half the board, right? So to satisfy the incremental requirement between 1/3 and half, a person who may have a pecuniary relationship outside of his remuneration could qualify as an independent director under the listing agreement. The interpretation issue is going to be what is material.
Material things which have been defined in the various accounting standards. The Companies Act itself, the new Companies Act, I think in section 149 D says something. It gives indirectly what are the levels of like 2%, 50 lakhs or more. That gives you guidance. Now, whether you say that no, a regulator says material, then define it. Then you have to go back to them and say, please define it. But I would rather say that, look, let it be a little open. What is material to you may not be material to me or to a third party. And sometimes even an immaterial relationship can be, can prove difficult.
The Fifth Amendment brings good news for schemes. SEBI's April circular laid down a special resolution requirement for divestments in material subsidiaries and sale, disposal and lease of assets that amount to more than 20% of the assets of the material subsidiary. The amended Clause 49 has done away with the special resolution requirement if the scheme has been approved by the court. Interestingly, there is another SEBI circular on schemes of arrangements from May last year that assumes importance here. It said that all schemes with related parties must be approved by the majority of minority shareholders. This raises the question, if a scheme is undertaken with a related party, will the amended Clause 49 apply or SEBI's May circular?
To my mind, it should be the majority of the minority, simply because this is a generic related party transaction circular, whereas the old SEBI circular in 2013 is specific to related party mergers and court-based schemes. So I would think specific prevails over generic.
The last key amendment brings good news for audit committees. SEBI's April circular mandated prior audit committee approval for all RPTs. The regulator has now enabled audit committees to grant an omnibus approval for RPTs that the company intends to enter into. There are, of course, time and value thresholds to these approvals. Overall, the amended Clause 49 is a dilution of the April circular at some places and alignment with the Companies Act at others. Whether it has been able to strike a balance between the requirements of companies and minority shareholders' interests, we'll know better once the clause goes live on October 1st. On that note, let's take a quick break on the firm. Coming up next.
The Supreme Court sets a new precedent for check bounce cases. Has the Apex Court made recovering of money onerous for creditors?